When one door closes, people often say another will open. But for Joshua Miller, every door was shut that night, and the key had been thrown into the fire. 17 years old. A sweltering September evening. He was just 3 steps away from touching the doorknob to his house when the sound of sirens sliced through the air like a blade. 3 police cruisers, a black SUV with no license plates, and Deshawn, his older brother, was face down on the concrete cold as steel blood trickling from his lip hands cuffed behind his back, as if he were some wild animal. Joshua couldn't remember what he screamed, or if he even screamed at all. He only remembered Deshawn's eyes finding his, and in that moment something tore forever, a fragment of childhood, a part of trust. No one told him what had happened, no charges were explained, no reasons were given. The police only said serious offense. The next day, the news called it murder, and in the grainy footage aired on the late-night report, they labeled Deshawn as a black suspect with a history of aggressive behavior. But Joshua knew better than anyone Deshawn didn't kill anyone. Deshawn had dropped out of school to work and pay their mother's hospital bills. He'd never raised a hand to anyone except once when he knocked out a drunk who was harassing an older woman outside the market. Their mother, Linda Miller, was lying in a cramped hospital room at Mercy Hospital at the time. 3 weeks later, she passed away, not because the cancer had spread, but because the mounting medical bills forced her to stop treatment. Joshua sat beside her bed when she went. She didn't speak, she only held his hand and slipped him a tiny piece of paper folded 8 times, its ink blurred from tears. It read only, "The truth won't protect you, but you must protect it." After the funeral, no one asked Joshua what he needed, no one visited. His classmates avoided eye contact. Teachers skipped over his name during roll call. Neighbors looked at him like he was the shadow of some terrible mistake. He learned to move like someone invisible, drawing no attention, leaving no trace. But in his mind, a machine had begun to stir. Not noisy, not rebellious, just questions, and then connections. Joshua pulled up old articles, mapped out the case, saved TV reports about Deshawn's arrest dates, times who said what and which words were used. There's a witness. We can't disclose the details. An off-record confession. But no one had ever heard of that witness. No one had ever seen that confession. And worse, Deshawn's court-appointed attorney never let Joshua access any files. He began going to the library every day after school, at first to learn about legal procedures, then criminal law, then notable wrongful conviction cases, then interrogation techniques. He took notes like a grown-up, building a system step by step, brick by brick. The librarian, Ms. Clara, a silver-haired woman in her 60s who always wore her hair in a neat braid, was the first to ask him, "What are you planning to study?" Joshua answered without hesitation, "I'm not planning to study. I'm planning to fix the law." From that moment, no one called him the victim anymore. Joshua chose a new role for himself. He wasn't just the younger brother of someone wrongly convicted. He was the last one holding the actual memory of who his brother was. And if no one else would believe it, he'd make sure they couldn't look away. Every night, he wrote fragments of journal entries and imagined conversations with his mother, not to find comfort, but to preserve the fire. One night he wrote, "I won't forgive, but I won't let hatred blind me. I'll use it to see more clearly." The world didn't wait for him. It kept spinning as if no one named Joshua Miller existed. But deep in the city's quiet heart, a silent tremor was building, and its epicenter was a 17-year-old black boy armed with a memory sharp as a blade, and a resolve no one saw coming until it was too late. This was the beginning, not of rebellion, but of a quiet campaign, one that would stretch the cracks in the system from the inside. And it all started. From that night, the public library was nothing special. The smell of old paper, pale fluorescent lights, keyboard taps and footsteps trying their best to stay quiet. But for Joshua, it was the only place that still made him feel like his feet were on solid ground. There he wasn't the killer's brother. He wasn't the student who lost his mom. There he was a reader. Someone was searching for the answer to an equation tampered with. Clara, the silver-haired librarian, didn't ask many questions. But she always had the books Joshua needed on his desk. Juvenile court law, historical precedents of wrongful convictions, and evidence evaluation protocols. At first he thought it was a coincidence, but after the fifth time, when she slid a thick file across the table and said page 87, section 3.2, coerced confessions, he realized she was quietly walking alongside him. In the early months following his mother's death and Deshawn's arrest, Joshua didn't speak more than 3 sentences to anyone. He went to school not for grades, but to avoid attention. After school, he went to the library, ate plain bread and uncooked instant noodles. At night, he rewatched old news segments, pausing every second to analyze every police statement and every anchor's facial expression. Gradually, he began to notice a strange pattern. The name of the lead prosecutor on Deshawn's case, Grayson, also appeared in at least 3 older news segments covering separate cases, all involving young black men, and ending the same way, pleaded guilty for a reduced sentence. In 87% of the cases prosecuted by Grayson over the past 5 years, defendants never went to trial. They accepted plea deals. Joshua learned that the term plea deal was the backbone of the American criminal court system. If a defendant pleaded guilty, they could avoid a harsher sentence, but in exchange their record would permanently mark them as a criminal, regardless of actual evidence. And that made the system run smoothly: fewer trials, fewer disputes, and more case closures for prosecutors. Joshua didn't sleep for many nights. He redrew the diagram. Who benefited? Prosecutors, yes. Judges, yes. Public defenders, yes. But the accused, no one asked if they were guilty. What mattered was that they nodded. The system recorded that nod. And that was it. One afternoon, Clara handed Joshua a small notebook. The leather cover was worn and without a title. Inside were handwritten notes from a former public defender who had left the system after a wrongful conviction case. The shaky handwriting described tactics used to coerce confessions, misrepresent case files, and bypass exculpatory evidence. The same sentence appeared at the bottom of each page. If I don't speak up, then who will? Joshua brought the notebook home, reading it under dim light. He realized he wasn't the first to see the rot within the system, but most who had seen it had turned away, or were forced into silence. The issue wasn't whether the truth existed. Who would be crazy enough to hold onto it and drag it into the light? That night, Joshua began writing the first lines of what he would later call the Shattered Glass Project. He had no gun, no lawyer, no media, but he had memory, and he began to wield it as a weapon, remembering every detail, every case, and every unanswered question. He wrote on a folded sheet of paper, "I don't have to win. I have to prove they're hiding something." From that day forward, Joshua was no longer the boy hiding behind books. He became the one who would rewrite a new chapter for his family with persistence, with facts, and with fire. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew there is always a seed in the ashes of every tragedy, and he would be the one to make it grow. As winter crept in like a cold-blooded snake, Joshua still went to the library with the regularity of a sacred ritual. But instead of just studying law, he now searched for something else, the common denominator in all the cases Grayson had prosecuted. Clara still didn't ask much, but one day, seeing Joshua buried in two towering stacks of case files, she said, "You're not the first to dig this deep, but if you've started, don't stop halfway. That's where it gets dangerous." He didn't know if that was advice or a warning, but it stuck in his head. And on one grey winter day, while reviewing a 2016 case file, a case eerily similar to Deshawn's, he found something odd. The witness statement certification date came after the sentencing date. A clerical error or a sign of something larger? Joshua wasn't sure, but he knew it was worth investigating. He took careful notes, then followed up on cases where public defenders had advised early guilty pleas to avoid risk. The list was unusually long. All defendants were minorities. None had strong physical evidence against them. All had voluntarily pleaded guilty. One night, Clara left an old book for Joshua, wrapped in brown paper. On the outside, 3 words written in ink, "Read when ready." It wasn't a book, but a handwritten journal, the Diary of A.M., a former journalist who had investigated the local court system in the early 2000s, who suddenly vanished from the media world. The writer mentioned a shadow alliance between 3 key positions: prosecutor, judge, and political donor. And one familiar name appeared: Carter. Malcolm Carter, a Latin American businessman who had donated over $1 million to Judge Holt's re-election campaign, the same judge presiding over Deshawn's case. Carter's name haunted Joshua. He hadn't been seen in the media lately, but every year large donations flowed into community support funds sponsored by Holt. Joshua dug into older records, financial transactions, meeting notes, and public speeches, all of which bore faint traces of Carter. But he always stayed in the background, never directly visible. Joshua understood that if this were just a single wrongful conviction, the system wouldn't flinch. But that would have had a massive impact if he had proven that the system was protecting itself and that those dispensing justice were working together to bury the truth for metrics, power, and money. Joshua was no longer working alone. A stranger, a woman in her early 30s, appeared at the library and introduced herself as Aisha Moore. She had been an investigative journalist, but resigned after her article about misconduct in the state prison system was taken down without reason. Clara had passed Joshua's information to her. "You need someone who can publish the truth right," Aisha said, "and I need someone who still believes in it." The two sat side by side for nearly a week without recordings, internet, or real names. They only shared facts, diagrams, and document copies. Aisha never praised Joshua as smart or special. She said, "What scares them isn't your knowledge. It's the fact that you don't back down." That sentence became an anchor inside Joshua. He knew he could never return to being a regular high school student. He couldn't pretend the world was still okay. He had seen the cracks. He had looked inside. And now there was no way back. He crossed out the old line in his notebook, "I just need to prove they're hiding something." He rewrote it, "I will make them expose themselves." Aisha wasn't like anyone Joshua had ever met. Not because she was sharp or analytical, but because she wasn't afraid of silence. While others filled the gaps with words, Aisha sat still and watched. Her eyes were dark, deep, and always in motion, seeming to see through layers of documents that had taken Joshua weeks to decipher. They met each afternoon at the library. Aisha brought her old laptop and offline copies of news articles wiped from the internet, and Joshua got his notebooks and his memory. They didn't talk much about their personal lives, but between them was an unspoken understanding, a silent pact that what they were doing would matter, even if no one ever validated it. It was Aisha who proposed, "It's time to strike." Joshua asked, "What do we have besides papers and a pile of notes?" "We have the truth." And a little well-timed anger. Their first plan wasn't to publish anything significant. They wanted to test the waters, probe the system. They picked an old case where the defendant was still alive and serving a light sentence, a young man named Ramon Ortiz, convicted of assault, even though hospital records showed the alleged victim had no serious injuries. In the case files, Grayson was the prosecutor, and the only testimony against Ramon came from a police officer who had previously been internally investigated, yet that detail had been scrubbed from the courtroom transcript. Aisha drafted a short article and submitted it to 3 independent media platforms. 2 declined. 1 agreed to post anonymously, without author or direct mention of the prosecutor. But shortly after it went live, the DA's office issued a formal denial, calling the article irresponsible fabrication. Less than 48 hours later, the platform received a legal warning. Bingo, Aisha smiled. "We hit a nerve." Joshua didn't smile, he was afraid. Not because of the threat, but because for the first time he realized the system wasn't passive. It didn't just twist the truth. It had a lightning-fast self-defense reflex. Clara quietly followed everything from the background and said just one line, "You've left the safe zone. Now you either retreat or learn to swim in fire." Joshua chose to swim. He and Aisha began reorganizing all their data. They built a private sharing network with triple encrypted passwords. Joshua wrote memos using his own coded shorthand, avoiding all searchable keywords. Aisha contacted former colleagues, asking them to retrieve forgotten files. They didn't just want to expose a case. They wanted to reveal a pattern, a mechanism built on power abuse cover-ups and protection for those at the top. 1 week later, Aisha returned to the library with a different look in her eyes. She handed Joshua a small black USB drive. A former court clerk who used to work under Judge Holt sent this. She said she couldn't stomach it anymore. A series of internal emails on the drive, including an exchange between Holt and Grayson referencing maintaining a high plea rate for quarterly reporting. One line was even more explicit: "Carter won't keep funding if that rate drops. You know that." Joshua went still. This wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a confession. He looked at Aisha. She said nothing, just nodded. The operation officially began that night, and the name they gave it, Joshua wrote on the whiteboard in red marker, was Witness 0. The first to witness, the first to remember, the first to refuse silence. Joshua woke up at 3:00 a.m., drenched in cold sweat. In his nightmare, Deshawn was sitting in a windowless interrogation room surrounded by faceless voices and blinding white lights. "You're not getting out, just plead. There's no one left out there for you." The voice was like a steel grinder, steady cold. Joshua bolted upright, grabbed the notebook beside his pillow, and recorded every detail, not because he believed in omens, but because every image came from something real. The next day, Joshua and Aisha focused on a case with a structure almost identical to Deshawn's, the case of Marlon James, a 20-year-old black man who was charged with second-degree murder. The incident occurred in an East Side neighborhood with no cameras, no fingerprints, only a third-party statement from someone allegedly near the scene. Marlon had been in prison for 6 years, and his confession consisted of just 4 sentences signed after 12 hours of continuous interrogation without a lawyer. Aisha found Marlon's mother, Mrs. Sharon James, through a support group for families of the wrongfully convicted. They met her at an abandoned church that hosted private gatherings. Sharon arrived with a crumpled old file folder and eyes hardened by time. "I used to believe that if I stayed quiet, justice would come on its own," she said in a voice devoid of hope. "But it never comes unless you drag it by the fingernails." Joshua flipped through the pages in her folder. One detail froze him. Marlon's confession form had been filled out in left-handed handwriting, even though his childhood medical records clearly stated he was right-handed. What did that mean? Aisha looked at him. "You think he was forced to write it?" Joshua didn't answer right away. But in his mind, a string of possibilities began to form. If the confession was fake transcribed, then the person who signed it wasn't Marlon. Or he was forced to do it while not in a conscious state. They found a copy of the interrogation video that had never been presented in court due to equipment failure. However, a test backup had been preserved in the data archive, which Aisha obtained through an old friend who worked as a technician. In the footage, Marlon slumped over the table for nearly 8 hours. He gave no clear answers, only repeated, "I don't know. I don't remember. I want to go home." Then came a 17-minute gap in the footage. When the video resumed, Marlon sat upright, his face pale, his hands trembling, and he was signing his name. Joshua clenched his fists. "This isn't an interrogation. This is coercion." Aisha nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. "We just witnessed a forced confession. And this isn't the first time. Witness Zero decided to release the video. They sent it to 2 independent investigative journalists and uploaded a 5-minute edited version online under an anonymous account tagged simply with #WitnessZero. The video went viral overnight. By morning, it had over 300,000 views. Grayson's name started trending in a flood of angry tweets. The DA's office was forced to respond and issued a short statement. "We will review the interrogation procedures in question." Joshua smiled for the first time in months, not because the system had changed, but because it was being forced to respond. It was the first step. Clara left him a sticky note. People can fake a statement, but they can't fake the eyes of someone forced to sign for a crime they didn't commit. Joshua stuck the note on the corner of his desk. Next to it was the case map, and in the center he marked a red dot, Marlon James, the first witness. The first door cracked open, but he knew the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would get. And blood might spill again, this time not in the interrogation room, but in the real world. The morning after the Marlon James video went viral, Joshua awoke to his phone ringing non-stop. Not family or friends. He didn't have many left, but unknown numbers, nameless messages and emails titled, "We are watching." Some were just warnings. Others carried veiled threats. One text read only 3 words. "Shut your mouth." Joshua didn't respond to any of them, but deep down he knew Witness Zero had hit the system's live wire, and like any machine pushed to the brink, the system had begun to strike back. Aisha, more experienced, immediately activated high-level anonymity protocols. They changed their access points daily, split their data into encrypted packets, and dispersed them across backup servers. But caution didn't mean safety. 3 days later, an old friend of Aisha's, a former data security technician, went missing. His final message to Aisha was, "I think I'm being followed." Joshua had never seen Aisha so silent. She didn't speak, didn't write, just sat and stared at the wall map where they had marked all data storage locations. She took a red marker and crossed out 3 points. From now on, only in-person meetings. No more messages. Nothing, not even a note. Clara handed Joshua a small wooden box in a rare moment that broke her silence. Inside was an old-school tape recorder, a magnetic tape model. "No one tracks what's been forgotten," she said. Joshua hugged her with a real hug, wordless. Then Witness Zero was attacked, literally. One of their data-gathering locations, an apartment rented under a fake name, was set on fire. Police labeled it an electrical accident, but nearby security footage, which they didn't review, showed two masked men exiting the building moments before the flames erupted. Joshua watched the footage without blinking. He didn't feel anger, just stillness. Inside that apartment were over 40 hours of recorded testimonies from families of the wrongfully convicted. All turned to ash. Aisha met with Joshua that night. She didn't talk about the loss. She asked only one question. If they come for Clara, what are you willing to do? Joshua didn't speak. But in his heart, a response rose that he'd never dared say before. I won't just protect those who speak the truth. I'll make those who silence them afraid. That was the moment Witness Zero changed. No longer just an expose. It became a counter-strike, going from covert to proactive, from hidden to exposed. Aisha proposed, we need a D-Day, the day to release everything. No leaks, no slow drip, one single blow all at once, sent everywhere, posted on every platform, delivered into the hands of the press and passed on to human rights organizations. And if someone fell because of it, the price would not be in vain. Joshua looked up at the case map. The red dots now covered it. Each case was a voice, each victim was a link in the chain, and Witness Zero was no longer just two people. There was now an entire underground network of volunteers, engineers, teachers, students, and even former police officers, each ready to play their part. D-Day was set, and Joshua wrote one final line in his journal, "Silence killed my brother." But now that same silence will be forced to speak. D-Day arrived without fanfare, no public declaration, no countdown clock, just another Monday morning. But at exactly 8:00 a.m., dozens of independent media outlets, blogs, forums, and social platforms simultaneously released a single file titled Witness Zero, The Truth Dossier. Inside were 432 pages of documents, videos, audio recordings, images, and hard evidence. Each entry was numbered, sourced, time-stamped, and carefully annotated. There were never-before-released witness statements and internal emails between influential individuals, and financial trail maps tracking money from businessman Carter to Judge Holt's campaign fund and Grayson's office. Within 6 hours, the hashtag #WitnessZero was trending #1 nationwide on Twitter. Major outlets jumped in, including CNN, MSNBC, then BBC and Al Jazeera, a wave that could not be stopped. The system's wall of silence, already cracking, began to collapse. At the same time, Joshua and Aisha disappeared, and there was no online activity or contact. Only Clara knew where they were, an abandoned train station once used as a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Now it was a temporary command center. LAN cables connected computers and batteries, provided backup power. Archived data is stored on external drives hidden in food containers. No one spoke loudly, no one wrote names. Then the system responded. First, a formal statement from the district attorney's office. We categorically deny all baseless allegations and will cooperate with federal authorities to investigate the source of this breach. Then came the indictment of an unidentified individual behind the campaign for unauthorized data access and dissemination of classified material. Joshua smiled. When they go from silence to counterattack, we're on the right track. But that night, Witness Zero suffered its first heartbreak. Selena, a law student and active member of the group, was found dead in her apartment. The media called it suicide due to academic pressure. But the network knew she had been in charge of compiling documents for two particularly sensitive cases. A week earlier, she told Joshua she felt she was being followed, as Aisha punched the wall, blood seeping from her knuckles. They've started cleaning house. Clara emerged from the station's shadows. She carried a thin file, an original draft of a civil complaint that had never been filed. The signature, Linda Miller, Joshua's mother. In it, she accused the authorities of unlawfully detaining Deshawn and denying him proper legal access. The complaint had never been accepted, and there was insufficient supporting evidence, they said. Joshua clutched the file, trembling. He realized his mother had started this fight long before he understood it. And Witness Zero wasn't something he created. It was a legacy he was continuing. The next morning in front of City Hall, a crowd gathered. No banners, no microphones. Just people standing silently, each holding a single sign, "I am a witness." Joshua saw the image from an old computer on a weak 3G connection. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. But in his heart, he understood the fire had caught, and now it would not go out. Linda Miller's file wasn't thick. No sensational clips, no massive financial records. Just a stack of handwritten pages, a few hospital receipts, some letters, 3 of which were never sent. But it was that simplicity that brought Joshua to tears. In every stroke of her pen, he didn't just see despair. He saw a quiet, unadorned strength, but as enduring as bedrock. One of the 3 letters was addressed to Deshawn's court-appointed lawyer. Linda had written, "I have no evidence, but I have a mother's instinct, and it's never been wrong." That line made Joshua pause for a long time. He thought of the nights she stayed up, staring out the window, as if waiting for something. He used to think it was sadness. Now he knew it was vigilance. Clara told him Linda had visited the library 3 times in her final year. She didn't borrow books, didn't ask questions. She just sat and looked at the shelves. She wasn't here to find answers, Clara said. She came hoping her son would. Joshua was stunned. He never knew. To him, his mother had always been quietly suffering, reserved, sometimes cold. But in truth, she had laid the first stones for the battle he was now fighting. And now that Witness Zero was no longer an anonymous group, but a national movement, Joshua understood that his role could no longer be that of a seeker of truth alone. Aisha looked at him differently. Not as a guide, but as a comrade. "You have to show your face," she said. "There's no other way. You have to say your name, stand before them. Show them that Witness Zero isn't just data, it's a person." Joshua knew what it meant, and he knew the cost. The moment he showed his face, everything would change. He would be hunted openly. No more anonymity, no more hiding. But from that very moment, Witness Zero would no longer be a shadow. It would have form of voice, blood, and a beating heart. That night, Joshua didn't sleep. He reread every document his mother had left behind and then wrote a letter to himself. In that letter, he didn't promise victory. He only promised that he would not betray his mother's faith or that of every person who had once remained silent out of fear. The next morning, Joshua went to the independent broadcast station where Aisha used to work. In front of the camera for the first time, he said his name, Joshua Miller, brother of Deshawn Miller, son of Linda Miller, and the founder of Witness Zero. The video was only 8 minutes long, but it spread across every platform. News outlets, social media, and even classrooms replayed it. Eventually, it was archived in the National Data Repository as a modern civil declaration. Joshua was no longer the shadow of grief. He had become the face of a hope-flawed, imperfect, but achingly real. And Linda, though gone, remained the quiet heartbeat in every step of Witness Zero. Right after Joshua went public, the wave of public attention hadn't settled. When Witness Zero received its response, not from the people or the media, but from the most profound veins of power, the federal government. A week after the recording, the FBI formally investigated Witness Zero. The stated reason: potential violations of cybersecurity laws and threats to the integrity of the judicial system. But Joshua knew the truth. It was intimidation, a move not just to choke the movement, but to scare off anyone thinking of joining. Law firms that once offered support began backing away. Some public supporters were fired from their jobs. A high school teacher who shared Joshua's video during civics class was suspended for promoting unverified political ideology. The backlash was swift, deep, and coordinated. Even within Witness Zero, cracks began to show. Some argued they should return to anonymity and focus on gathering more evidence instead of confrontation. Another faction, mostly younger members, pushed for greater visibility, protests, marches, and taking to the streets. Joshua felt torn between two currents. He didn't want to sacrifice precision, but he knew the moment's urgency was a rare chance to sway public opinion. Aisha was unwavering. One step back now, and it's over. That night in the library basement, the core team of Witness Zero met. It was a turning point. For the first time, Clara spoke out against Aisha. "We're fueling hope with fire," she said, "but who takes responsibility when that fire burns the people who trusted us?" Joshua said nothing. He quietly studied the caseboard, faces, names, and unresolved stories. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note, a piece of his mother's handwritten letter he always carried. Justice doesn't just happen. It must be demanded bit by bit by those who refuse to stay silent. He looked up and met every gaze in the room. "We won't retreat, but we won't run into the streets empty-handed either. We will prove that the system itself is breaking its laws. Not out of anger, but because truth cannot be outrun forever." The room fell silent. Then came the nods, one by one. Witness Zero entered Phase 2, legal confrontation. No longer an anonymous campaign, they would file a federal lawsuit based on the documented evidence, demanding an investigation into Prosecutor Grayson and Judge Holt. Joshua signed the filing before he turned 18. And in the history of the U.S. justice system, it marked the first time a teenager became the plaintiff in a case against two of the highest officials in a local judiciary. The abyss had answered, and Witness Zero chose not to flinch. The court date was set for a gloomy Tuesday, grey skies and light rain, as if even the weather grasped the weight of the hearing. The federal courthouse wasn't unfamiliar to Joshua. As a child, he had sat outside it for hours, waiting for his mother to finish procedures he never understood. But today he entered as the plaintiff. The courtroom was closed with no cameras or media. Only the legal representatives of Witness Zero, the defense teams for Grayson and Holt, and a handful of approved observers, including Aisha Clara and two delegates from human rights organizations, were present. Though entitled to appoint an adult representative, Joshua insisted on delivering the opening statement himself. "We are not here to win," he began, voice steady and clear. "We are here to demand an answer. Why isn't justice meant for all?" The defendants denied all allegations, asserting that the evidence had been collected improperly and accusing Witness Zero of manipulating facts for political purposes. The hearing lasted over 5 hours. Audio recordings, letters, and financial records were presented one by one. Some evidence was hotly contested and some was dismissed. But one recording silenced the entire room. An anonymous confession from a former district attorney's office employee confirmed that Grayson had once instructed staff to select cases that could be manipulated to keep conviction rates high. The federal judge did not issue a verdict that day. However, a preliminary ruling was made to open an independent investigation into the operations of the DA's office and the county judicial system. The next hearing was set for 6 weeks later. As he stepped out of court, Joshua didn't feel victorious. He only felt a part of the weight lifted. Aisha exhaled in relief. "You've shaken the wall." The media swarmed. Social media exploded. Those who had remained silent began sharing their own stories. A former police officer spoke out. An exonerated victim uploaded original court footage. A public defender resigned to join Witness Zero. And at the center of it all stood Joshua, a 17-year-old black teenager, standing in the eye of the storm, never once looking away from his compass. Justice isn't a result, it's a relentless act. In his journal, he wrote, "We haven't won." But for the first time, they had to answer. The temporary victory didn't bring relief. Instead, it triggered a more substantial, swifter backlash from the system. The real storm had just begun. Joshua's legal team's office was broken into 2 days after the federal probe was announced. Nothing of significant value was stolen, but files were ransacked. The central server was infected with malware, and key files vanished without a trace. This wasn't a warning, it was a declaration of war. Joshua went dark for 48 hours. He and Aisha traveled to an abandoned communications post in the mountains, a former wartime emergency radio hub. There, they gathered the core members of Witness Zero, those who had gone public. Those are still hiding, and those ready to testify if the system would let them speak. Each person brought a piece of evidence, a part of their story, a drop of their blood. A former court clerk described being forced to alter witness transcripts. A grieving father spoke of losing his son to a rushed 2-hour trial. A law student shared how she'd been suspended for speaking on unequal justice. Joshua quietly recorded it all, not just for the archives, but to carry into the battles ahead. Aisha was being tracked. Her phone had become a listening device. They discovered this when a private comment between her and Joshua about unreleased evidence was referenced in a pro-Grayson article. Clara went silent upon hearing it. She only said, "They're carving us from the inside." Joshua made the next move. He filed a motion for a public hearing on the entire prosecutorial framework of the county, not just on Grayson or Holt. At the same time, Witness Zero released its second dossier. The Power Map is a web of financial, familial, and political ties between judges, prosecutors, business magnates, and campaign donors. The map went viral. But in return, Witness Zero was countersued for defamation, misinformation, and incitement. At a small protest outside the courthouse, a car rammed into a group of students. 2 were severely injured. The driver fled. The media called it a traffic accident, but Joshua knew blood had touched the final fence. He was no longer just the storyteller. He had become the symbol. And that shining sword justice drawn by Witness Zero was now facing enemies ready to shatter it. Before leaving the communications post, Joshua scrawled a line on the brick wall. In his journal entry that day, "Bones grow stronger when they break. Truth, when crushed, echoes louder. We are not afraid, we are only sharpening." As Witness Zero reeled, a message appeared in Joshua's encrypted inbox. "Only one line: I'm willing to testify if you can protect me." Attached was a 42-second voice recording. The voice was raspy, low, and all too familiar to Aisha. It was the voice of Charles Redding, former special assistant to Judge Holt. His name had vanished from all records 3 years ago after citing medical leave. But Witness Zero had long suspected the truth. He had been accused of tampering with evidence and destroying original files, yet the case was buried. Now, if he came forward, he wouldn't just be a whistleblower. but a detonator. Aisha spent 3 days tracing his whereabouts through non-profit hospital networks. Redding was living in a rehabilitation home in Ohio, recovering from a stroke. Joshua Clara and a human rights attorney visited him unannounced. He looked at them, eyes bloodshot, and his first words were, "I thought I'd die with this guilt." Redding confessed. In 2017, he was ordered to clean up a botched criminal case, the very one that launched Holt's power and Grayson's conviction metrics. He admitted to destroying original testimonies, rewriting timelines, and inserting false statements. He even kept a copy and was now willing to testify in court. His only condition, witness zero must secure him federal witness protection, something only official authorities could grant. Joshua returned sleepless for 2 nights. Then he did the unthinkable. He petitioned the FBI to help protect Redding in exchange for cooperation in the federal investigation. The decision shook Witness Zero. A movement built to expose the system was now asking it for help. Many members objected, but Joshua said only one sentence: to change the machine, you have to use its gears. On the day Redding testified, a heavy rain fell. The media flooded the federal courthouse. He strolled needing 2 aides, but his voice didn't tremble. "I stayed silent out of fear. I speak now because I am still human." His testimony opened the door to criminal investigations against both Grayson and Holt. No longer just a civil suit, Witness Zero was now threatening to topple the entire county judiciary. An unprecedented move in modern state legal history. Joshua did not smile. He knew the storm ahead would be ferocious. But for the first time, he saw light on the horizon, not from fire, but from justice finally breaking through. Following Redding's testimony, an independent commission was formed. In under 3 weeks, they issued a preliminary report. There is credible evidence that multiple cases in Hamilton County over the past decade were manipulated through political and financial ties between prosecutors and the judiciary. Grayson resigned under public pressure. Holt was suspended. A full audit was ordered. The press called it a silent earthquake. No riots, no bloodshed. But hundreds of thousands took to the streets not to destroy, but to stand still, each holding a white sheet of paper. On it, only one sentence: "We have heard the truth." Joshua watched everything unfold from the rooftop of the library where it all began. He didn't give a speech, didn't write an op-ed. He stood beside Clara and Aisha, silently watching the crowd shift like a tide. Witness Zero was no longer a campaign. It had become a symbol for a generation brave enough to question what was once accepted as absolute. He received an invitation to speak before the United Nations Human Rights Council, an offer to write a book, full scholarships from 3 top universities, but he declined them all. Joshua accepted only one role: unpaid legal assistant for a witness protection project. "I don't need to be on a stage," he said. "I just want to stand behind those still too afraid to enter the light." One afternoon, he returned to his mother's old room. Beneath the mattress, he found a small notebook scrawled with a line, "If you're reading this, it means you've gone farther than I ever dared." Joshua held the notebook to his chest. Sunlight poured through the broken window, illuminating the faded ink. The sun may never rise fully, but light always finds a way through the cracks. Justice is never perfect, but justice takes shape in the hands of those who keep walking toward it. From now on, Witness Zero will be part of that shape. 1 year after the investigation closed, Joshua stood before a small classroom in a community center. The room was modest, with 2 whiteboards, a few rows of wooden desks, and sunlight spilling in from open windows. Before him sat 15 students, not academic stars, but those expelled and labeled not fit for the system. Justice doesn't start in a courtroom. Joshua began holding a copy of the Witness Zero dossier. It starts the moment you dare to ask a question. Each student carried a story. A wound, a false accusation, a silence too long endured. But when they sat together, it wasn't the past that remained. It was the flame once lit by a single mother, a 17-year-old boy, and an old library. Witness Zero was now a real organization, no longer a guerrilla campaign. It had an office, educational programs, and pro bono lawyers for the wrongly accused. But more than anything, it was a place where people no longer had to whisper the truth. Joshua no longer led Witness Zero. He passed that role to Aisha, the keeper of the fire he called her. As for himself, he spent his time teaching, traveling to remote areas, and writing down untold stories. One night, returning to the library, he found a small note taped to the wooden door. "A little girl came today and asked, 'Does the truth always win?' We didn't answer. We just seated her next to the third shelf." Joshua smiled. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Outside, the wind still blew, but inside, the fire still burned. The story didn't end. It was continued by those who understood that justice doesn't come because you deserve it. It comes because you never stop demanding it. Joshua sat alone in the quiet library at night, watching the golden light cast shadows across the shelves. He was no longer the 17-year-old boy, no longer the main character of the story. But in his eyes, one thing remained unchanged aflame. The updated Witness Zero dossier was on the table for the next generation. He wrote one final line: "If you hold this file, the story is still unfolding, and you are the one chosen to continue it." This was no longer Joshua's story, nor Linda's. It belonged to anyone who had ever been silenced, rendered invisible, or longed to rise without knowing where to start. Witness Zero didn't need a leader, it needed keepers of the promise. At the end of the dossier, Joshua taped a small mirror, so that anyone who opened it would see the first face they must confront, their own. "Justice has no fixed shape," he wrote, "but every action you take, every question you dare ask, every truth you refuse to turn away from, adds a line to that face." He stood up and turned off the light, but before stepping out, he looked back where it all began, and whispered, "Don't let the fire go out, not for me, but because you lit it."